Author and commentator Eric Metaxas, Christian churches should focus on proclaiming the gospel and discipleship. But is our ability to do that at risk because of what's happening in government and the culture?
Yes, it is at risk. I think religious freedom is something that, like all the freedoms, it's not natural. It's God-given, but it's not natural. Natural state of affairs is oppression and lack of freedom. And so we need to understand that we have to fight for freedom and we have to fight for religious freedom. And for Christians, we need to know, what does the Constitution say? What did the founders say about how I can live my faith? It's very clear that we're supposed to be able to exercise our faith with utter freedom. I think a lot of Christians aren't aware of that. We need to be aware of that, and then we need to exercise our faith with utter freedom. And then when somebody says you can't do that, you say, well, of course I can do that. This is America, and this is not a country where you can enforce secularism. This is a country where everyone gets to express their points of view and express their faith, and sharing my faith is a way of doing that. But in a sense, Christians have to push back more. And I'm not talking about being militant, but I'm talking about a lack of fear. I'm talking about, if more Christians would do this, it would seem normal. But if only a few are doing it, it seems, like that's not for me. That's extra credit Christianity. It's not. It's normal Christianity.
Well, let's talk about a couple of tangible things churches can do to not only protect religious freedom, but also the ability of Christians to live out their faith.
Well, I think that the one thing that I always say is that if churches aren't willing to risk their 501c3 status, we'll never get anywhere. We have to be pushing up against that regularly, because I think by playing it safe, we only constrict ourselves more and more. We really, again, have to know what our rights are as Americans, and we have to exercise those rights. And I think to the extent that people don't do that, we're painting ourselves into a corner. We have to be, I'm not sure this is what you're asking me, but I was saying that in a sense we have to be bolder in our faith. I don't mean militant, but I mean bolder, more courageous, less afraid to express ourselves. We need to know what it is that we believe, and we need to know what the American Constitution says we can do with that faith. And a lot of us really don't.
What would you say to the argument that churches should stick with the gospel and winning souls to Christ and leave the politics and the social issues, the moral issues to others? And doing so otherwise will only get you in trouble with your congregation and the IRS.
Well, like anything else, there's truth to that, okay? So there is some truth to that, and sometimes people are overly political. Sometimes people are looking for trouble. But let me say this: generally speaking, it's a bad idea and a false idea. Because when people say I only want to preach the gospel, I want to ask, and what gospel is it that you're preaching? I have no idea that if somebody is looking for good news and freedom in Jesus, there are many things you won't be able to say if you're afraid of getting political. William Wilberforce was political. Why? Because he loved the Africans who were suffering. He cared about them enough to get very political. Dietrich Bonhoeffer cared about the Jews who were suffering horribly, and he knew that the God he worships cares about those Jews, and he says, I'm not going to shut up, and if that means I'm going to bump up against some political government, state forces, so be it. That's really has nothing to do with me. I'm just going to do what God calls me to do. So the idea that we can share, quote unquote, share the gospel and not be political, it's at its heart a complete lie, a complete misunderstanding of what the gospel is. If you care about people who are suffering, you are inevitably at times going to be political. And the idea that I have to shrink from that to preach the gospel, as I say, it's just a false idea. And every time I hear it, I'm amazed that there are Christians who would believe such a thing.
Well, based on your travels, are you seeing signs that churches are starting to get it, that they're starting to speak out?
Yes and no. I really think it depends on the churches. I think that, courage is never something that exists in great supply. Human beings, especially when you're in a place as free and as wealthy as the United States of America, we've been very comfortable. We don't want to lose those comforts. People who are suffering, people who are in in the third world, people who are in China, North Korea. It's a completely different thing. They have total freedom because they have nothing to lose. We have a lot to lose. We've been comfortable, as I say, and I think the question is has the American church become so comfortable that we're going to fall asleep in our Barca lounger rather than get up and do the work the Lord's called us to do? That is the question. There are some people who are getting it. There will always be many who don't get it. So I would simply say it's up to each person, and by God's grace, enough of us will get it to avert disaster.
Final question. How critical is it for Christians to vote their biblical values this election?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, for Christians to vote. When I heard in the last election, for example, that some Christians didn't vote because they wouldn't vote for a Mormon, I cannot tell you how disgusted I was. We are not voting on theology. We're voting for a president. And if anybody thinks that Eisenhower or any president like that had theology any more biblical than Mitt Romney, then clearly their sense of history is terrible. I think that we have to vote. You know, to paraphrase Dietrich Bonhoeffer, not to vote is to vote. The idea that I'm going to sit this one out, you're voting for someone. Someone's going to win, and if you don't want that person to win, you need to vote. So I'm deeply grieved by Christians who have not voted or who are so theologically fussy that they wouldn't vote for a candidate that doesn't share their particular faith. We should vote for anyone who we think would make a good president. And as I say, most of the great presidents did not have theology that I would approve of, but I would approve of their leadership as president. And I think as far as that goes, we of course have to vote. Our values, if we don't do it, we deserve what we get. And it really does. I'd say if Christians don't get out and vote in this next election, you know, God's judging us. We're the ones that are going to get judged, and it's a scary thing.
Eric Metaxas, thank you for joining us here in IllinoisFamily.org, and God bless.
Thank you.
This has been brought to you by the Illinois Family Institute, promoting marriage, family, life, and liberty in the land of Lincoln. For more information, go to IllinoisFamily.org.